Have you ever felt a sudden, inexplicable chill when you're walking near a dark river or lake at night? You know, that creeping, heavy sensation right at the back of your neck that tells you definitely aren't alone? Well, for centuries across Latin America, that specific, suffocating dread has had a name: La Llorona, the weeping woman. But listen, if you think you actually know the story of La Llorona, I want you to prepare to be deeply, deeply unsettled. In this explainer, we are going to completely gut this ancient legend. We're going to peel back the layers of this myth one by one to reveal a historical reality that is far darker and honestly far more terrifying than any simple campfire ghost story you've ever heard.
Okay, let's dive into this. To get to the truth, we have to go way back. Way before she was a ghost in a white dress haunting riverbanks, she was actually a harbinger of the literal apocalypse. According to ancient historical chronicles, about 10 years before the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés even arrived on the shores of modern-day Mexico, the Aztec people of Tenochtitlan were plagued by these bizarre, completely terrifying omens. And the absolute most frightening one of all, it was the wailing of a woman, echoing through the dead of night. But here's the thing, she wasn't mourning the dead, she was mourning the living. Her cries piercing through the capital were interpreted by the Aztecs as a divine, inescapable warning of the absolute destruction of their entire empire. She was quite literally foreseeing the bloody, violent end of her world.
But of course, that apocalyptic warning is not the story most of us grew up with, right? The traditional folklore that we are also familiar with today paints her as this doomed, cursed murderer. The standard myth usually goes something like this. A beautiful woman, often described as indigenous or mestiza, falls deeply in love with a wealthy Spanish nobleman. When he inevitably abandons her, she is driven completely mad by grief and rage. And in a horrifying, unthinkable act of vengeance, she drags their children to a river and drowns them. Realizing the horror of what she's just done, she kills herself, only to be rejected by heaven itself. She's then cursed to wander the earth forever, weeping, desperately searching the riverbanks for the children she murdered. It is a profoundly terrifying cautionary tale, but we are about to completely tear this narrative apart to see how a grand prophecy of civilization-ending doom was twisted into a deeply personal story of maternal sin.
To really grasp the true horror of La Llorona, we absolutely have to travel back to Mesoamerica in the 1500s. This was a period of intense, suffocating cosmological dread for the Aztecs. By the time Cortés finally arrived in 1519, the psychological groundwork for absolute devastation was already laid thick by those terrifying omens we talked about. And by 1521, just 2 years later, Tenochtitlan had fallen in a catastrophic, unimaginable wave of blood and fire. So think about this. The weeping figure that preceded all this trauma wasn't a human woman who committed a crime. Not at all. She was an apocalyptic warning. She was a spiritual, visceral manifestation of the collective agony that was about to unfold. The brutal collision of two worlds and the violent erasure of an entire ancient civilization.
Now this is where it gets really fascinating. In stark contrast to the modern ghost story, pre-Hispanic cultures viewed these weeping feminine figures with profound, deep reverence. In the Aztec worldview, water, motherhood, and death were deeply intertwined, but absolutely not in a shameful or sinful way. For instance, Xicoatl was a fearsome, incredibly powerful goddess of motherhood and war, and she was often depicted weeping for the tragic destiny of her people. And then you have the Cihuateteo. These were the spirits of women who had died in childbirth. Now, the Aztecs didn't view these women as cursed sinners, quite the opposite actually. Childbirth was literally considered a battlefield. Mothers who died in labor were revered as divine fallen warriors, given the exact same honor as elite male soldiers who died in combat. So weeping, in this era, was this powerful communal ritual that connected the people to the cosmos.
And this stark contrast brilliantly illustrates the horrific colonial twist at the heart of this legend. Just look at the shift. On one side, you have a divine, empowered mother figure mourning the tragic destiny of her entire civilization. On the other, you have a demonized, cursed murderer. Do you see what happened here? It's actually incredibly sinister. The Spanish colonizers encountered this deeply ingrained, powerful cultural symbol of divine feminine mourning, and they completely inverted it. They violently stripped away her divinity, they stripped away her warrior status, and her massive cosmic significance. And what did they replace it with? They reduced her to a hysterical, sinful woman who committed the ultimate unnatural act, killing her own offspring.
You have to realize this wasn't just some simple misunderstanding of local folklore over time. No, this was a highly calculated weaponization of a myth. The strategy of psychological terror here was simple but brutally effective. First, appropriate the indigenous goddess. Second, completely demonize her. And third, use her for absolute social control. In that incredibly rigid colonial society, this terrifying new version of La Llorona served as a highly insidious tool of social policing. It was essentially a dark, creeping warning, specifically to indigenous and mestiza women. Do not mix with the Spanish elite. Do not step out of your designated social class. And above all else, obey the strict moral codes of the church, or you are going to end up a cursed, demonic monster wandering alone in the dark forever.
So the crucial takeaway here is that demonizing La Llorona was the deliberate, incredibly insidious strategy to just completely erase indigenous ideology. By taking a deeply revered figure and twisting her into a literal child-murdering monster, the colonizers were effectively telling the native population that their past, their beliefs, and their very spiritual foundations were demonic and entirely unnatural. It was a deeply psychological attack. It was meant to sever the indigenous people's connection to their ancestral deities, replacing that sense of empowerment and communal mourning with deep shame, deeply rooted fear, and this eternal suffocating sense of guilt. It's psychological warfare, plain and simple.
But here's the thing about a myth that is this deeply rooted in the psychology of a people. It doesn't just stay neatly in one place. As the colonial era dragged on, this psychological weapon spread far, far beyond Mexico. It mutated. Honestly, it spread almost like a virus, adapting itself to the specific fears, the specific landscapes, and the unique moral panics of different regions. It essentially created a true continent of tears. The core element was always there, the weeping, terrifying mother, but the nightmares morphed and shifted in really disturbing ways to fit the local terrors of various Latin American cultures.
Let's look at how violently this trauma adapted across different borders, because it is wildly creepy. In Peru, the legend morphed into La Muñeca. This is about a young student who tries to hide her pregnancy, only to have her baby stolen out in the thick fog by a demon disguised as a wealthy, handsome foreigner riding a horse. Then, over in Venezuela, she becomes a young woman abandoned by a soldier. And in one particularly gruesome, localized variation of this, a priest actually tells her to nurse her child before killing it. This violently awakens her maternal instinct right at the last second, dooming her to this eternal, agonizing guilt. And in Panama, she's La Tula-Vieja, a young mother who cares more about partying than her baby, leaving the child completely alone until the devil himself steals it away by the river. In every single one of these variations, you can see how the myth is perfectly tailored to deeply frighten and relentlessly police the behavior of women in those specific, localized societies.
Now, if you fast forward to today, it is wild to see how modern media often gets this entirely, completely wrong. Recent mainstream American horror films have taken La Llorona, completely stripped her of all that profound, devastating cultural context we just talked about, and just reduced her to a generic screaming monster hiding in a closet or under a bed. It's totally superficial, popcorn horror, it's cheap. But as we've seen, the true horror of La Llorona isn't a cheap jump scare. The true horror is the real-world trauma, the centuries of colonial violence, and the historical erasure that her eternal weeping actually represents. That is so much scarier than a monster in a closet.
But thankfully, not all modern storytellers have forgotten her true roots. To see how this myth can be brilliantly reclaimed, we have to look at Jairo Bustamante's masterful 2020 film, which is simply titled La Llorona. Bustamante violently grounds the supernatural horror of the legend in a devastating, very modern reality, the horrific 1980s Guatemalan genocide of the Maya Ixil population. Instead of just some random boogeyman targeting an unsuspecting American family, the legend is brought back home. It's weaponized against the very real flesh and blood monsters of history.
So let me set the scene for you in this film. The story follows General Enrique Monteverde, who is a fictionalized echo of the real-life historical dictator Efraín Ríos Montt. Now, the general is put on trial for orchestrating the brutal genocide of native Mayans, but his conviction is overturned on a technicality, allowing him to entirely escape justice. In response to this, the outraged, grieving public surrounds his lavish mansion, literally trapping him and his privileged family inside. And just as the tension is absolutely peaking, a mysterious indigenous maid named Alma arrives to work for the family. But as you might guess, Alma is not just a maid. She is a supernatural force, bringing the full, crushing historical weight of the La Llorona legend right to the dictator's front door.
Now, what's really interesting about how this unfolds is how the film uses this suffocating claustrophobia to execute its horror. Inside the dictator's private, highly privileged spaces, the terrifying reality of his monstrous actions begins to close in on them. The relentless, haunting chanting of the protesters outside literally bleeds through the walls of the mansion. The archival footage of the real-life atrocities invades their television screens. The inescapable memory of the general's crimes begins to physically manifest inside the house. The family is entirely trapped, forced to confront the absolute horror of what their patriarch has done, as the ancient myth of La Llorona violently seeps into their day-to-day reality.
And it's here, in this modern masterpiece,
that the ancient entity undergoes a profound and completely terrifying transformation. She's no longer that colonial nightmare we discussed earlier. The cursed, weak mother who killed her own children out of jealousy or madness. Not anymore. Instead, she becomes the vengeful spirit of justice. Alma, embodying La Llorona, represents the thousands of indigenous mothers whose children were violently ripped from them and murdered by the state. She is a fierce, unstoppable protector. She's seeking a brutal, cosmic reckoning for the innocent lives that the human justice system completely failed to avenge.
And this dynamic builds what is arguably a uniquely suffocating kind of terror, something known academically as the dislocation of memory. Now, this concept is the ultimate horror for any oppressor. It's the forced, inescapable realization that the traumatic past cannot simply be buried in a mass grave, it can't be ignored, and it certainly can't be legislated away by a corrupt court. The past aggressively, violently invades and haunts the present. The truly terrifying realization for the dictator and his complicit family is that the ghosts of their victims are not gone. They are right here, they are incredibly angry, and they will never ever rest until true justice is served.
Which brings us to a really powerful, incredibly emotional resolution of this myth. The tears of La Llorona are not just the selfish sorrow of a single mad woman. They are the collective trauma, the agonizing, bleeding memory of an entire continent. When we finally take the time to truly understand her history, evolving from an ancient Aztec omen into a dark weapon of colonial oppression and finally into a modern, fierce avatar for justice against genocide, we have to completely redefine her eternal weeping. It is not a sign of weakness. It's not a sign of sin. It is a powerful, haunting refusal to let the dead be forgotten. Her relentless cry is literally the voice of history demanding to be heard.
So, as we wrap up this explainer and our descent into the true darkness of this legend, I want to leave you with a chilling thought, something to make you reconsider literally everything you thought you knew. What if the real monster isn't the woman crying in the river, but a society that violently pushed her into it? The next time you find yourself near the water at night and you hear a wail in the dark, ask yourself, is she coming to take you away? Or is she just demanding that you remember the history we've all tried so incredibly hard to drown? Keep questioning the stories you've been told, because the truth is almost always scarier.